All right, everyone. We are just about ready to get started. Chloe, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, awesome. Okay. Well, again, welcome everyone.
Bienvenidos a todos.
Thank you for joining us for the Funding for Grassroots Change webinar tonight.
Gracias por unirse con nosotros para este webinario sobre financiamiento para el cambio a nivel de la base.
Before we get started, we have just a quick note that we'll be doing simultaneous English to Spanish interpretation throughout this call tonight.
Antes de empezar, una nota breve, que tenemos interpretación simultánea de inglés a español durante la llamada.
All right, if you would like to access the interpretation for the Spanish, see the screen instructions below.
Si te gustaría acceder a la línea de interpretación a español, ve la pantalla para las instrucciones.
We'll give folks a few minutes to connect and then we'll start.
Vamos a dar unos minutos para dejar que las personas conecten y después empezamos.
All right, everyone. Hello again. Thanks for joining us for the webinar this evening. My name is Brittany Nesbitt, and I am the program coordinator for the Southern Equality Fund. The Southern Equality Fund is a project of the Campaign for Southern Equality, which some of you may be familiar with. We provide tools like funding and training for Southern grassroots LGBT organizers. Before we get into the agenda tonight, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items. First things first, the webinar is being recorded and we will provide the links to the recording and other materials for tonight via email to all participants. We will also keep all participants muted throughout the call. Please use the chat window for any communication throughout the call, to ask questions, or to communicate any technical difficulties. The chat button can be found at the bottom toolbar of your Zoom window. And now I want to go into our host for the evening. That'll be joining us for the Funding for Grassroots Change webinar. Gabriel Foster with the Trans Justice Funding Project helped to plan this webinar but could not join us tonight. So standing in for him, we'll have Quentin Q. Bell. He was the grant making fellow for the Trans Justice Funding Project for the 2016 grant cycle, and he is also the founder and executive director of the Knights and Orchid Society in Selma, Alabama. Joy Messenger will be joining us from Third Wave Fund. Maya B. Chatterjee is joining us from the Australia Lesbian Foundation for Justice. And Ryan Lee Dahlstrom is joining us from the Fund for Transgenerations, which is a project of the Borealis Philanthropy. And Chantel Fisherborn with Out in the South Initiative, which is a project of the Funders for LGBTQ Issues, will be joining us as well. And the interpreters we have on our line are Cecilia and Ava. So tonight, just to do a quick run through of our agenda, we're going to start off with demystifying philanthropy and grant making with Ryan Lee, and we'll have Chantel helping him out with that. Afterwards, we'll have Funding in the South by Chantel Fisherborn, and we'll have Joy Messenger and Maya B. Chatterjee doing some information sharing on prioritizing queer and trans people of color-led work. After that, we'll give the panelists some time to talk about their individual funding opportunities. This is a time where they can talk about any grant rounds that they'll have open and what kind of applications grantees are looking for to funding. And then after that, we'll have our question and answer session. That'll be open and we'll go through the questions. Panelists can also ask the participants questions as well. And then we'll go into some brief wrap up after that. All right, Ryan Lee and Chantel, I'll let you take it over from here. Ryan, we can't hear you if you are speaking.
Oh, no, I think I was muted for a minute. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Brittany and Campaign for Southern Equality, for inviting me to be a participant in this discussion. And just really excited to be here and grateful to have this conversation with everyone. Before I start, I wanted to also just acknowledge Gabriel Foster. We co-developed this section, and so much of our thinking for this section was definitely a joint effort by the two of us. So our hope for this conversation is really to just start by affirming folks' experiences in navigating philanthropy, and often recognizing that there are just a lot of barriers to even understanding how grant making works, how philanthropy operates, and then hopefully leave this part of the section with at least some tips and strategies based on things that both Gabriel and I have learned, both now in a funder role, but previously both of us come out of doing community-based work in trans people of color communities, and so definitely are coming to this conversation with our own experiences trying to understand philanthropy and find grants for different community-based work that we both have been a part of. So first off, just want to share and say that obviously one of the biggest barriers, I think, and hopefully something we can break down and offer opportunities on this call, is just even knowing how to find foundation grants and opportunities. We know that a lot of times in philanthropy, there aren't always a lot of calls or open calls for proposals, and there's oftentimes are invite only or just not really easy to find, through the internet or other types of searches for open funding calls. So we do hope to share on this call some open calls that we all know about or are part of in terms of the different funds that we represent. Also, just want to say that I think funders, we can do a lot better job to both get a wider net of outreach in terms of when we do have calls for proposals out. And part of that, I think, is through strengthening partnerships with regional, national, and local groups, similar to how I think we've worked on forming a relationship with Campaign for Southern Equality, it's just really important for us as funders to do better at really getting the word out, and also to coordinate with each other better. So I know a lot of us on this call have been working on ways to just be more in touch with each other around different exciting organizations that we hear about or groups that we know are fundraising, and to be able to try to share proposals or share information about groups that we hear might be looking for a specific funding opportunity for a project or something that folks are working on. Another huge barrier I know I experienced, and a lot of folks experience probably on this call, is just not always having access to grant writing, like what makes a strong proposal, how to sort of navigate a grant application. And so I know there's some coaches and consultants on this call, and I know at Borealis that's something that we really try to work with our grantee partners and provide capacity building support and coaching support for folks to be able to better have a sense of how to write a strong application. And we're going to give some tips and strategies for that later on the call today. Also, I think it's often challenging to find out who to contact at a specific foundation, and that oftentimes foundation contact information isn't always super accessible on websites. And so again, I think it just shows the importance for calls like this and other opportunities to engage with program officers and folks who are working at foundations, so that more people can have access to getting information. We also know that a lot of times, including many, I think, folks on this call, a lot of foundations require having an organization having a C3 status or a fiscal sponsor. And unfortunately, at Borealis Philanthropy, that's currently a barrier that we have. We're not able to fund groups that aren't fiscally sponsored. But there are other folks on this call who are reducing that barrier and able to fund groups that aren't fiscally sponsored, which is great. And I think my hope is that we'll continue to have more foundations that are able to do that, because I know that a lot of the folks on this call and a lot of folks in queer, trans, people of color organizing work are doing really amazing radical work, and may or may not want to engage in the C3 structure or have a fiscal sponsor. And I really want to be able to see that barrier reduced so that folks can access resources and continue the important work that they're doing. One other barrier that we've received feedback at Borealis around is wanting to ensure, and it's so great that this call is being simultaneously interpreted, but we know that a lot of information is not accessible in multiple languages. And so we at Borealis and at the Fund for Transgenerations have been working on that. And so we are actually now able to accept applications in Spanish. And we also have been making an effort to make more of our materials accessible in Spanish. But again, just to name that, these aren't new things to probably anyone on the call, but Gabriel and I just wanted to name them as things that are challenging in terms of being able to fund and support the work that many of you are doing on this call. Also, we know that philanthropy can be often very jargony, and that there's a lot of language that is not accessible to lots of communities. And so I think we can continue to do a better job as funders to reduce jargony language and make things more understandable and accessible to all different kinds of communities. And then lastly, I just want to say that we also recognize that there is a real power dynamic between grantees and applicants and funders, and that just gets challenging at times, particularly when a lot of us come out of doing community work and are still in community, but we're also may now be funders and are navigating various kinds of relationships in community, and at the same time recognizing that sadly, there is often a limited amount of funding available, and that many of the same small groups and grassroots organizing groups are competing or seeking out the same kinds of funds. And so we just know that that is a current challenge, and we need to, have more resources available and get more foundations and more philanthropy to support the kinds of work that a lot of folks here on this call are doing. And I'm looking forward to hearing more from Chantel later in terms of some of the work that out in the South and certain projects have attempted to sort of really help bring more resources to often under-resourced issues in specific communities. So a couple of things I just want to leave us with to think about in terms of tips and strategies and things that I've learned and Gabriel and I were talking about. I know myself, when I first got one of my first rejection letters from a funder, I was devastated. I felt terrible. I felt like, I had let down my community or let down the organization that really needed the resources that we were looking to receive, and often felt kind of a bit of a shame or a bit just bad and didn't necessarily know what to do with that. And I learned from another program officer and someone who was a friend at the time said, I can't tell you how many times I've had to, unfortunately, decline an application, but I've offered to a group, hey, I'm sorry we're declining you right now, but I'm happy to set up a call and talk with you about your application. And what he told me is the majority of folks never follow up with him and never take that opportunity to have a conversation with him. And I definitely probably was that person at one point. And so my just sort of tip or strategy offering is just that now working as a program officer and in a funding role, it was a real opportunity. It can be a real opportunity to learn and to talk with your funder or potential funder to really get more information about, and get feedback on your proposal, as well as, a no now, just like I learned when I was doing grassroots fundraising, a no now doesn't necessarily mean a no forever. It may later turn into a yes. There may be other funding opportunities down the road. There might be a specific kind of project or fund that might be available. And so just in the future. And so it's just an opportunity to get feedback and also to, build that relationship with your program officer or with the person who's working at the fund. And connected to building a relationship with a program officer, I also, as a grant seeker, didn't really understand what a program officer was or what their role was. Now I am a program officer and I'm still adjusting to that new role. And I guess I would just say that I think part of my job as a program officer is to really understand and help advocate for the work that folks are doing and to help make the case to the folks that fund my project and who are the ultimate decision makers. And so just to say that I think to me, that's one of the important roles of a program officer, is to really just build relationship with groups, to understand the work, and to hopefully be able to make a case internally that can help advocate for your work and to help make the connection within our foundation and the values and priorities that we have within our fund. There's a lot more I could say on that, but I'm running short on time, but I'm happy to continue the conversation and answer questions after this, as is Gabriel. But I'll also say briefly that another thing I didn't necessarily understand was just the difference between kind of public, private, and family foundations. And so just to say, that could be a whole half session on that, but just to understand, we want to encourage folks to think about doing your own research and just really understanding kind of the audience of the foundation that you're submitting an application to. So, in the example of, say, maybe there's a foundation you're applying to that cares about health. It's not about necessarily changing your frame to talk about your organization in a different way than what you do, but to kind of help make the case and make a connection to what that foundation might prioritize. So we'll hopefully get to talk a little bit more about this later. And like I said, I'm happy to be a resource and talk to folks more about this. And sorry, I'm going a little over my time, but I'll pass it on to Chantel. And if you want to add anything, Chantel, before you start your section, go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, Riley, and that's okay. I think everything you had to say was definitely important as far as doing grant applications. Chantel, if you want to go ahead on and start.
Right. Hi, everybody. Let me see if I think I have to start my video to share my screen. So good evening. I am, this is Chantel Fisher-Born. I think I'm a voice that you can hear me. Can someone let me know you can hear me over the chat? I can a little bit. hang on, I'm having a little technical difficulty over here. Am I doing a share screen?
Yes, we can see your screen, Chantal.
Lovely, thanks, Chloe. Okay, hi everybody. So here we are. It's past 6 o'clock, so we're having some technical difficulties in North Carolina. So I'm here in Durham, North Carolina. Happy to be invited by our friends at Campaign for Southern Equality to be part of this. My job this evening is to just talk to you in the next 9.5 minutes, just give you a sort of a broader context for LGBT funding, and tell you a little bit about our work to transform funding for Southern communities so that we increase support for LGBTQ communities in the South. So my first slide is just telling you a little bit about the organization that I work for. It's called Funders for LGBTQ Issues. It is pretty self-explanatory. We are an affinity group of foundations that care about LGBTQ communities around the globe. We do this work in a couple of different ways. We bring funders together to tackle sort of complex, sort of field-wide issues to help support more LGBTQ communities. And we do outreach and support services like trainings and organizational development work with foundations. And then we do research and communications work. While my organization is based in, sorry, I skipped. In New York, they had the good sense to hire a Southern person for the work with the Out in the South project. So I'm the Southern Outpost here in Durham. And I want to tell you a little bit about some trends for LGBT funding and tell you a little bit about how we landed on the Out in the South initiative over the last couple of years. So this graph shows over the last 40 some odd years, the increase in funding for LGBTQ communities. And this is from institutional philanthropy. As you can see in the 70s, pretty minuscule funding support, and then up toward $160 million more recently. And this work is really the result of folks who care about LGBTQ people and communities working in philanthropy to make it so that foundations saw LGBTQ people as part of the communities that we care about. And a shout out to the Australia Lesbian Foundation for Justice. Back in the mid-70s, they were the first public LGBT foundation started way back then. So I've been doing this kind of activism within philanthropy for a long time, and we're happy to be part of that work. So even though we've seen a significant increase in funding for LGBTQ communities over the last 40 years, we also know it's, when you take in the whole sort of field of philanthropy, LGBTQ communities are woefully underfunded. So one of the statistics that we use is to say that for every $100 that foundations award, only 27 cents specifically benefits LGBTQ communities. So if you think about this for a second, we know that if we can make a small increase really on the broader scale of philanthropy giving to LGBTQ communities, we can significantly increase the support given to the communities we care about. Another way to look at it is looking at the largest US foundations. So looking at the 100 largest foundations in the country, less than half of them made a grant to LGBTQ communities in 2015, which is a very, very small percentage. And only more than 1% of grant making is a very small percentage. So we look at the larger group here is definitely just making a very small dent in the work for LGBTQ communities. And I'm being told to slow down by my folks here. So one of the things we look at is funding by region around the country. This is one of the things that inspired the Out in the South initiative, was looking at the US regions and how disparately funded different regions are. So if you look at this chart in 2012 compared to 2015, you see the South goes from almost down near the mountain part of the US. And what this did was inspire a lot of our members to come together and say, we need to change the fact that the southern part of the United States is so woefully underfunded. And this increase in funding is good news, but we want to talk about what that means and where that's actually going in a bit. So then we look at funding per LGBT adult by region. And we like to call this dollars per queer. If you look at funding per capita around in the regions, we know that funding per LGBTQ adult, the South was the lowest throughout the country. And so we had several members, both Southern and national funders, come together to create a strategy that would change this reality, that would increase funding for Southern communities. And we identified some core strategies that involve being more responsive to Southern communities so that we were able to support and build locally driven philanthropy. Because sometimes national funders cannot have very much local context for LGBT work, particularly in the South. So trying to localize the conversation about what funding needs look like in the South. We do a lot of work with both national and Southern funders to raise awareness, do education and training. And we build a network of funders throughout the region. We also do a pooled fund, which supports philanthropic efforts in the South to support LGBTQ communities. We're happy that the Campaign for Southern Equality, through their Southern Equality Fund, is one of our current grantees. We fund a myriad of groups that do various efforts to increase funding for LGBTQ communities. Some are LGBT funds housed at community foundations. I see our friends in Birmingham are on this call. We also fund funder collaboratives that work at the statewide level to increase funding for Southern funders who currently don't fund LGBTQ issues. And like our funding for the Campaign for Southern Equality, we're funding a couple intermediary groups who work in the Southern region around LGBT movement work to really answer this question about how we better support grassroots work. So I'm excited to be part of this call because that's a big issue that we often identify, is the fact that so much of the heart and soul of organizing work happens with volunteer groups that are often run with little to no budget in the South. And how do we help funders see the importance of this work and build their grant making so that it matches with the needs of these groups? And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So progress so far about the Southern work, as I mentioned in one of my first slides, we've seen a great increase in funding for Southern communities. We actually set out some benchmarks when we launched the initiative back in 2012, and we've greatly surpassed those benchmarks. As you can see, our data is a year behind. So the most recent data we have is for 2015, and we surpassed our $9 million goal. $17.1 million for Southern communities, which is a great problem to have. We have to reconsider our goals for the coming years. And I wanted to share with you the top 10 funders in the South. One of the takeaways from this list of groups are a couple things. Most of these are national funders. And in the world of philanthropy, to be able to be on the top 10 list and be offering $655,000 is a relatively low number. So we want to see the top 10 list being larger investments and also encouraging Southern funders to be part of this group. We often know that national funders may not have the local context to be able to connect with grassroots organizations in the South. And again, brings the importance of groups like the Campaign for Southern Equality. Wanted to share with you some data that we have based on funding by state in the South. This graph shows you over the last 3 years where funding has max level of funding for Southern states at the state level. You can see where like the Florida, Georgia, Texas being the top 3 funded states. One way to make sense of that is those 3 states also have a pretty significant philanthropic infrastructure. So that means more funding overall in those states from institutional funders. We also know that those states have stronger LGBT stronger infrastructure, larger LGBTQ organizations in those states as well. So funders can maybe potentially more easily find organizations in those states to support. And then we can look at Southern funding by issue. So we also code funding data based on issues. They're here listed out for you around issues of violence, homophobia, and transphobia, economic poverty issues or economic justice, education, safe schools. You can see the purple line here is civil and human rights work. A lot of funding goes toward advocacy efforts in the South. We also know that there's a lot of direct service work that needs to be better funded, which we often don't see funders supporting in Southern communities. And so what I wanted to leave you with was the current state of funding, give you a sense of kind of the broader field of LGBT funding There are a lot of groups doing work to shift the priorities in philanthropy so that LGBTQ people are seen as part of every community people care about, and trying to make connections with foundations who care about certain issues such as health or education, so they can see how LGBTQ people are impacted by those issues. And at the end of the day, we help to support funders partner better with LGBTQ organizations and also work with their current grantees to do better by LGBTQ people. And I wanted to just show you these last couple slides. Some of the take-home messages that we offer to funders, it's really about changing how funders understand Southern communities. And some of the main points that we find resonate most with changing people's stories about who LGBTQ Southerners are using some of this hard data around the demographic information we have. And the fact that the South is home to more LGBTQ adults than any other region in the country often surprises a lot of our colleagues. And then the fact that LGBTQ Southerners are more likely to be folks of color, be poor, and be raising children. That often, again, goes against this strong narrative we have that LGBTQ people only live in big cities like San Francisco and New York. And so part of our work has really been to help change the story about who Southern people are and where, and how the conditions that LGBTQ Southerners live in. One other piece of the puzzle that we feel resonates strongly with funders when we do our education and what I consider sort of this narrative shift work is to highlight the fact that there are lots of organizations doing great work in the South. Sometimes funders will be like, well, there's just not, I don't know where I could invest or who I could support. Over the last couple of years, we've been working on what we've called an asset mapping project, which we've have a list of over 750 organizations throughout the region. We're actually updating that list, and we'll have a searchable database on our website later this summer to highlight and to share with funders who's doing work in their own backyards, really. And then one of the, I think, most resonant issues that we can talk about with in this context is that the majority of the groups working in the South are significantly under-resourced, but also are often working with few or no staff and very little, if any, budget. And so helping funders to think about, if they care about LGBTQ issues, they have to see grassroots organizations as part of a healthy ecosystem in their communities, and how they might think about when they make grants to make grants accessible to those groups. And whether that's being creative, you're going to hear some really creative ideas about how these funders on this panel are making the grant access much more easy for folks who, like I said, so doing phone interviews or making the application process much more accessible for folks. And so those are the kinds of conversations that we're having in a broader context with Southern and national funders about how we might increase money for Southern communities. So, and I just want to say that, this Southern Equality Fund at CSE is a great example of a way in which an intermediary like CSE is working to really support organizations that otherwise don't have connection with current funding structures. And so just want to send a shout out to the work that Chloe and Jasmine and Brittany and the team are doing around that. So with that, I will figure out how to stop my screen share, Brittany.
Thank you so much, Chantel. We definitely appreciate it. Definitely couldn't do it without Out in the South having our back here. I'm going to turn it over to Chloe.
Thanks, Brittany. Before Maya B and Joy share about why it's important to prioritize work led by queer and trans people of color, I wanted to share briefly why we've included this next topic in the agenda. Specifically, when we look at funds that prioritize grassroots groups, and by grassroots groups, we mean startups, groups that don't have 501c3s, groups that maybe have never received a large grant before, groups that are predominantly, if not all, volunteer-led. Funds that prioritize these grassroots groups, which are very few, also typically explicitly state that they prioritize queer and trans people of color-led work. We also know that there are a good number of grassroots groups in the South with very few resources, who are isolated, are run by folks who struggle on a daily basis with their economic situation. And these groups a lot of times are led by white folks and cisgender folks. And so for white-led and cisgender-led groups who may be seeking their first grants, it might feel discouraging to not see yourself reflected in the stated priorities of the few grassroots funding options available. And that's a valid experience. So we wanted to have this conversation today in hopes that we can all leave the webinar with a shared understanding of why the priority of funding queer and trans people of color-led work is so important, especially in the South, and with a shared understanding of how white and cis-led groups can still engage with this priority in their work and in their communities, and how we all have a role, regardless of identity or geography, in this commitment to uplifting and centering the leadership of queer and trans people of color. So I'm happy to answer any questions folks might have or discuss this further with anyone interested after the webinar. You all should have my email. I have been the one sending you all notifications and reminders. So without further ado, I will pass the mic to Mayabi and Joy. Hold on one second while I unmute y'all.
Hi everyone, this is Mayabi. I hope you can all hear me, and if Chloe and Brittany, if you'd like to start my video, I'm more than happy to share my face with the crowd. For the next part, Joy and I don't have, I see, thanks. We don't have slides, but we just wanted to talk to you face to face, as it were, and share a little bit more, going off of what Chloe just said to you. Obviously, every region of the U.S. and the lands that the U.S. has occupied has its own history with racism and white supremacy. And we know that when it comes to the South, since we're looking particularly at the South this evening, there are really specific, deep histories of the way that anti-Black racism shows up in our work, and anti-Black racism, anti-people of color, anti-immigrant sentiment. That history often comes through in a way that means that people of color have not been listened to, right? Have not been valued, have not been in leadership positions in the LGBTQ movement. Or they've been in positions that weren't paid as much, weren't recognized as much, weren't valued or heard as much. And certainly in the funding world, white-led LGBTQ work has gotten a lot more dollars than people of color-led LGBTQ work. So a lot of us funders are trying to reverse that trend and to stop ignoring and excluding people of color, queer and trans people of color on all levels, right? And it's not just about history, it exists now too, right? It's what we're all going through in this moment. And we know as people who are former organizers, as funders now, we've learned that from social movement history that if we listen to the people who have experienced lots of different kinds of harm, right? Lots of different kinds of discrimination, many forms of prejudice, then we're not going to leave anybody behind, right? We're not going to keep on the same patterns of leaving certain more marginalized groups behind. So, and I think a lot of us believe in our movement building and in our funding that the people who have faced lots of different kinds of harm are the ones who have lots of different kinds of solutions to offer us, right? Lots of different forms of wisdom and many kinds of survival strategies. Joy and I are going to go back and forth a little bit in this section, so I'll leave it to Joy next.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining tonight's webinar, and thank you to the Campaign for Southern Equality and the Southern Equality Fund for asking me to be part of it. In thinking about why we center uh, work that's being led by queer and trans people of color. We also know that many of you who are queer and trans people of color, as applicants, as grantees, and as funders together, we see LGBTQ justice as being connected to racial justice, being connected to economic justice, to immigrant justice, to disability justice, and never being a separate or isolated movement. So when we're looking at different LGBTQ groups, we often prioritize the groups that make the connections between these different issues and who center the leadership of people of color, low-income people, trans people, immigrants, and others. As I mentioned, we know that economic justice is key to LGBTQ liberation. And because of that, many of our organizations do support the activism and organizing of low-income white folks, because we know that those communities have been under-resourced as well and have been denied resources, especially from philanthropy, for a lot of reasons related to classism and often ignoring the needs of rural areas. And so we invite white-led groups to see our funds as potential funders of yours, as long as other issues like economic justice, racial justice, immigrant justice, and others are centered. We also wanted to add a couple of tips in thinking about how you can talk about ways that queer and trans people of color work is prioritized or is integrated into white-led and multiracial organizing. So the first one that we are constantly asking people at Third Wave is to include examples of what your beliefs look like in practice when you're writing grant applications or when you're having conversations with foundation staff. So this, for example, this could look like not just talking about your group's belief in diversity or intersectionality or youth leadership, but how transgender people, people of color, immigrants, young people, disabled folks are part of the leadership, the decision-making, and the planning. I'll pass it back to Maya B. To add some other tips.
Keeping on going with tips and strategies, because I know we do want to get hands-on here. If you are from a group that is mostly white or led by white people, it can often be really, really helpful for us as program officers to hear details about what your community is like. Who are you organizing with? What does the neighborhood or the town or the parish or the county look like? Is it mostly poor and working class? What do people do? What are some of the hardships that people are facing besides just discrimination against LGBTQ people? I mean, obviously that's a lot already that people are going through, but when we understand more context of what people's lives are like, we have a better way to understand how the LGBTQ struggle in your community is connected to economic justice, right? It's connected to economic transitions in the South. And what are your relationships to the immigrant communities in your town, in your county, in your region? What's your relationship to people of color and the way they organize? And so to give you a sense of a way that could be really successful is I'm thinking of a grantee partner in Vermont in a very, very white area. That works with LGBTQ folks, many of them in rural towns. And they, in their applications to us, they often talk about how they do anti-oppression training and racial justice training with their people, young, old, in between. And they talk intentionally about whiteness. And they talk about their region's history with kind of divide and conquer amongst working class people. sorry, that's probably not a very easy term to translate into Spanish, but like the deep divisions amongst people who have commonalities in a lot of ways, right? They talk about the divisions between immigrant workers and white workers in rural Vermont. So we know who they identify with and how they're identifying with racial justice struggles. Because I think, as Chloe was saying, we're all a part of racial justice struggles. And we all can play a role, but it helps in an application if we see examples of how you do that work, and stories and how it fits into your programming, rather than just naming people of color individuals that might be on your board or on your staff or your volunteers. That says less to us, I think, than how you involve it in the day-to-day life of your group or your organization. And also, the last thing I'm going to say, I think, is that when you do struggle with engaging people of color, I think honesty and being frank and acknowledging that is really important. You can try to evade the question. That's another tactic, right? You can say, we don't really ask what our members' race or ethnicity is. You could say we welcome everyone regardless of race and ethnicity. Or I think what helps everyone more is if you're frank and you just do real talk about, we've had troubles in this sector. We would love some tools and resources from like-minded groups who understand the type of work we do, to engage more. And we're open to building bridges, and that, I think, says more. And I know plenty of groups who have been able to do that and grow because of that. Yeah, I think that's what we had.
Yeah, we'll send it back over to Brittany, I think.
Yes. All right. Thank y'all so much. Please reach out to funders. That's what we're learning today. They want to help you. All right. So this next section, since we are running a little bit behind, I'm going to let our panelists speak briefly about any open grant cycles that they have available, and particularly who's eligible. Do you have to be a 501c3? And that kind of information. So if y'all could just give a short explanation of the grant rounds that y'all have open right now, that would be great. And Q, you are up first.
Okay, thank you, Brittany. Again, I'm representing Trans Justice Funding Project, which is a community-led funding initiative founded in 2012 to support grassroots trans justice groups run by and for trans people. Currently, TJFP doesn't have funding applications open. Applications typically open December, and they run through mid-February. So it will be open in December 2017. A little bit about who TJFP funds. In order to be eligible to apply for a grant, it's quite simple. It's a simple application process, about 9 questions that you have to complete. But the criteria is simple. You have to have a group, which means you have to have at least 2 or more individuals. It can be a grassroots group focused on trans justice, has to be run by and for trans people. Transgender non-conforming people need to be in actual leadership positions. You have to have a total budget.
Q, sorry to interrupt. If you could slow down just a bit, thanks.
Okay, sorry about that. You do have to have a total budget of $250,000 or less. TJFP has had groups in the past to apply who don't have any budget. So there is no minimum budget, but you can't have a budget of more than $250,000. You have to be located in the United States, including Puerto Rico. TJFP does not currently fund globally. They fund projects that center the leadership of trans people, organizing around their experiences with racism, economic injustice, trans misogyny, ableism, immigration, incarceration, and other intersecting oppressions. TJFP also responds to the needs of different local communities. They use organizing and providing services to bring people together. What I specifically love about TJFP, being both a funder and having an opportunity to participate on the panel as a grant maker, is the fact that the TJFP is one of the few organizations that's able to give without restrictions. TJFP really believes in allowing the people who are in the community working. They really believe that the people who are on the ground, on the grassroots level doing the work, are the ones who know the best way they need to utilize the funding. So there are no stipulations on how you use the funding. The next grants, again, will open up December 2017, and those applications will be available through mid-February. Around February 15th is the cutoff. You do not have to be incorporated. You do not have to be 501c3. Previously, grants have been given away in increments of $1,000, $2,500, and $5,000. This year, through some strenuous fundraising efforts through TJFP, the grant making panel, myself and 5 others were able to give away $500,000 to 153 organizations. And we were able to even increase the amounts that we gave away. We were able to give away up to $10,000 to some groups. So that's a little bit about TJFP and what opportunities we have available. And if you have any more questions, feel free to reach out to us. I'll turn it back over to you, Chloe.
Okay, great. You can put my video up if you would like, Brittany. I'm happy to talk so people can see my face. Let's see. I don't know if I'm showing up as the one who's talking, but hi, everyone. Again, I'm Joy, and I'm a program officer with Third Wave Fund. For folks who haven't heard about Third Wave, we are a feminist fund that was started in the late 90s to support young feminist organizing in the United States. And so we fund only in the United States. Since then, our funding priorities have expanded under the umbrella of youth-led gender justice, which envisions a world free from patriarchy, misogyny, homophobia, and transphobia. In this, it includes movements for queer and trans liberation as part of our gender justice framework. As a funder, we support the leadership of young women of color, transgender, intersex, gender nonconforming, and queer youth of color in low-income communities who are most directly impacted by oppression. We also focus on regions and issues that are marginalized within existing movements for social justice, and that historically have received less funding than other issues or regions. We fund nationally, so like across the US, although most of our funding goes to local, state, and regional groups. And we also fund across issues, so we fund a range of issues that fall under gender justice. But we focus on strategies like organizing, political education, advocacy, direct action, and healing justice that address the root causes of gender injustice to create changes in people's lived experiences, not just in the policies that govern our country. So I wanted to share information about 3 different funding streams. 2 of them are open for funding, open for applications right now, but I wanted to mention the 3rd one just so you all knew about it. The first one is our Mobilize Power Fund. And since the Mobilize Power Fund started about 2 years ago, we've given out about $220,000 through 65 grants. And the Mobilize Power Fund is a rapid response fund for urgent and timely organizing, activism, and healing justice. We accept applications up to $5,000 per group that's applying, so more for a partnership or a coalition of folks that are applying together. It's open to non-501c3s or folks that don't have a fiscal sponsor. We take applications for the Mobilize Power Fund 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 or 66 days a year. And applications are reviewed monthly on the second Tuesday. We also take applications by written narrative, phone interview, selfie video, and evaluate the proposals based on leadership, your connections to gender justice, and the urgency of your request. We also have the Own Our Power Fund, which just launched a couple of weeks ago, which is a capacity building fund around leadership, sustainability, and self-representation, taking proposals of $10,000 to $25,000 per year for 1 to 2 year projects. This is open to 501c3 and fiscally sponsored groups. Applications for the Own Our Power Fund are due on July 25th. We have an informational webinar that's happening tomorrow afternoon. The fund that's currently not open, but that I wanted to mention, is our Grow Power Fund, which is multi-year funding for new and emerging youth-led groups, up to $35,000 in general operating and capacity building support. We're currently funding 6 groups in Durham, North Carolina, Minneapolis, Chicago, El Paso, Phoenix, and LA. And our 2017 cycle is already in progress, and we take applications for the Grow Power Fund by invite and nomination. But if you have questions about the Mobilize Power Fund or the Own Our Power Fund, I'm happy to answer them. And I am going to pass it on to our next presenter.
Hi all, it's Maya B again. You can turn on my video if you'd like, Brittany. And I am representing the Australia Lesbian Foundation for Justice. So Australia has a number of different kinds of funding available in the US to amazing, brilliant, and brave groups, including a fund that focuses on the South and focuses on both LGBTQ and racial justice. But they have not yet had an open call for proposals, so I'm not going to say a whole lot about that. But hopefully they are going to have a call for proposals from small organizations in the next 6 months. So if you want to make sure you get that call for proposals, just go to Australia's website and sign up for Australia emails. And that way you'll always get updated about our calls for proposals. But our open call in the US, I will be very brief, is for a giving circle called Funding Queerly. Hopefully some of you have heard about it before. It's about 4 or 5 years old. We prioritize LGBTQ communities who face multiple different kinds of discrimination or harm. Currently, we also prioritize specifically Black-led and undocumented-led groups. And community organizing needs to be one of your primary strategies. The groups are mostly $10,000 per year. Some are $5,000. Your organization has to be $250,000 a year budget or less. But I will definitely also echo Q in saying that a lot of our applicants are brand new, budget of $0, coming up with a budget for the first time, and that's totally fine. The open call is in the winter, and it's a pretty simple 4-page application. We just rewrote all the questions entirely this year to make them a lot more, hopefully, easy to answer. And we do phone and Zoom interviews in the spring, and the decisions take about 6 months. The decisions are made by a small group of young LGBTQ donors who are passionate about getting as many dollars out to you all as possible. As of now, you do need nonprofit status or a fiscal sponsor, but I'm almost positive that by next December, when we make our next call for proposals, we will have figured out our shit and gotten rid of that requirement. I also wanted to very briefly mention a sister fund to us that I really love, that I hope more people apply to, which is called Resist. The website is resist.org, and they too have a simple application They have 6 funding cycles a year. So if you miss one deadline, the next deadline is 2 months later. They fund a lot of new emerging groups. They fund groups all over progressive social justice movements. Your organization must be less than $150,000 a year in budget. Let's see. They also have an emergency grant program where they take rolling applications and try to get you an answer very soon. And their decisions are made by an activist grant-making panel. And I believe you do at this time still have to have 501c3 status or a fiscal sponsor for Resist. But the wonderful folks over at Resist would be happy to answer your questions if you reach out to them. I will pass it to Ryan Lee. Thanks, y'all.
Hi there. Yes, you can go ahead and start my video. Hopefully you can also hear me. Let's see. Okay, great. Hi, everyone. So yeah, I wanted to just share a little bit about the Fund for Transgenerations. So we launched the fund in October of this past year, and myself and Kiyomi Fujikawa are the 2 staff members that work on the Fund for Transgenerations. So exciting to have some of our grantee partners on this call. Hello to you who are with us today. So we are a donor collaborative. We have 3 current funders who are funding the project with the hopes of increasing that and getting more donors to the table to increase our total grant making. The values of the fund are so some of the things that we value are moving beyond equality to justice. Intersectional feminism, which we've been given some feedback is a bit jargony, but really wanting to ground in queer, trans, and gender nonconforming communities of color. We have a commitment to addressing, we have a commitment to supporting groups that are addressing the root causes of transphobia, misogyny, racism, classism, and homophobia, as well as ableism and some other isms that aren't listed on that list. Also focus on the resilience of trans communities and leaders of the trans movements, and a commitment to solidarity, collaboration, and transparency. So those are the values that guide our fund and are what we look for in the types of groups that we support. To date, we have made 59 grants for general support grants, and 45 of those groups, many of whom have budgets of $100,000 or less, many of whom have not had access to national funding or much grant funding before. So one of our values is also prioritizing groups who haven't had access to a lot of funding before, and hoping to help get folks access to other funding in addition to our fund. We also have made about 15 rapid response grants since October. We will be having an open call again this fall, so we will be inviting a small number of new grants, and eligibility-wise, folks have to be US based. We do also fund a range of different issues, groups that are based regionally, nationally, and locally. Groups must be trans-led, and unfortunately at this point groups do need to have a fiscal sponsor or be a C3. We're continuing to try to figure out a way to work around that. I don't think that may not be yet set up for the second year of funding. Also just want to say that some of our priorities for the second year are really to continue to support smaller budget groups, so budgets of probably $200,000 or less, and again, groups who haven't had access to a lot of other funding streams. We also do have a focus on organizing and advocacy, also recognizing that folks are often doing a multi-prong approach. So, want to just see that folks are addressing root causes to oppression and have a strong commitment to racial justice. Our grants, general grants right now are a range of $15,000 up to $30,000. And you will be receiving, and I'm happy to either be emailed directly if you aren't yet on our mailing list, or to email me and just ask me directly more questions. But we will be opening a call shortly, and we'll also have an informational webinar to answer any questions folks have in August, with a deadline of September for the application itself. And then just briefly, we also have rapid response grants that we make throughout the year. Those can be up to $20,000, but we have not yet actually made one of that size. So average grants tend to be $5,000 to $10,000. And just to real quickly say, we are able to accept applications by video or in Spanish, as long as you answer all of the narrative questions, which we do try to make pretty straightforward. Right now, it's about 6 narrative questions. And as Maybe mentioned before, we also love to get to just hear more about your local or regional context, and what about your region or the work you're doing has led you to take on the particular strategy, or why that's important to your specific area. So that's feedback we've received from our advisory committee, just wanting to get a better sense of what it really looks like in your local context. I think that's it. Thanks. I'll pass it back to you, Brittany.
All righty. Thank you so much, y'all. I hope you all were taking notes. Again, this will be recorded, and get this money, y'all. Next up, we're going to go through a few questions that we had here. We are running a little bit behind, so if we do not get to all of your questions tonight, you can add them to the chat box and we'll follow up from there. Or you can send Chloe or myself an email and we'll also follow up with you then. Also, the panelists on the call tonight have volunteered to share their email addresses with us. And so we'll be emailing those out to you all as well. Okay. So I'm looking here. I wanted to give Jeannie Taylor an opportunity to speak about their grant round really quickly.
Okay, I'll just go ahead and unmute Jeannie. Jeannie, you are unmuted.
Okay, the Community Foundation of Greater Birmingham has opened a round of grants due in on the 27th. They are small grants, but they are for anyone within the Greater Birmingham area, which is Jefferson, Blount, Walker, St. Clair, Shelby, and Blount counties. I've put the link up on the website or the group chat, and I hope we hear from somebody. We are focused on particularly interested in grants from non-traditional organizations, although certainly are open to anyone.
All righty. Thank you so much. It looks like, Joy, you've answered your question so far about the webinar tomorrow. I'm not seeing any other questions coming up right now. Do the panelists have anything that they have a question about? Does anybody else want to add
Brittany,
anything?
someone just sent a question to me. I can read it out.
Okay.
This is from Russ. I have a question about the meaning of fiscal sponsorship for a group. I am a co-advisor for a LGBTQIA student group within a small rural state university, which provides no funding for LGBT issues. The student group has virtually no budget. Is the group or the university status what matters in the funding decisions? And I'm going to go ahead and unmute all the panelists in case anybody wants to jump in to answer that question.
Can you repeat the question, please, Chloe?
Yes. You got Chantel, maybe Ryan. 1 second, let me get everybody unmuted. All right, that should be everybody. Okay, so the question is, what is the meaning of fiscal sponsorship for a group? This is being asked by a co-advisor for a LGBTQA student group that is in a small rural state university, which provides no funding for LGBT issues. And the student group has virtually no budget. And so they're wondering, is the group itself or the university status that matters in the funding decisions?
I mean, I can answer. What I think what you're asking is sort of 501c3 status. So universities are 501c3s for the most part, technically. I think that maybe what you're asking is whether that counts as fiscal sponsorship. I think it really just depends on the relationship. What I've seen other groups do as far as like finding fiscal sponsors when, you know, the university can often be kind of way too much of a heavy bureaucracy for folks, but sometimes they can find a department or something that will be a good partner. I think it just really depends. But I guess if your question though is like C3 status, which is the status for a lot of grant makers, that would be the case for your university, I would imagine. I don't know if others have something else to say about that.
The way that I'm understanding the question is, like, would a group that's part of the university, when they're applying, would the fact that they're part of the university be counted against them? Is the way that I'm understanding the question. Or
maybe
like,
so. Yeah.
As their fiscal sponsor, like is it just like the group itself that's being evaluated? So for third wave, we would look at the group, its resources, its budget, and its needs as being the applicant, and then the university as being the fiscal sponsor, and kind of figuring out the ways that money can go through, say, like an Office of Student Services, or like Chantel had suggested, like utilizing a department in order to have funds. And so when we have groups that are fiscally sponsored, but we also have budget priorities. We look at the applicant's budget rather than the fiscal sponsor's budget. We know that fiscal sponsors can have large budgets and lots of infrastructure, which is often library services sponsors. If I misunderstood the question and you have other, like whoever asked the question wanted to clarify what they meant, that would be helpful. And then maybe we can answer the question the way that you had intended.
Can you all hear me?
No.
Okay. This is Brittany. We had one question from Gwendolyn. She wanted to know if there were any specific Tennessee funders that you all knew about. I was gonna ask Chantel in particular. I know you do a lot of Southern LGBT funding, but I'm not sure.
Say that again, Brittany. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble with my audio, but say that one more time.
Are there any specific Tennessee funders that you know about?
Yeah, we have Appalachian Community Foundation.
Okay.
So there's a couple that I could. Let me. Can we get this person's info? That's the first one that comes to mind. It would be Appalachian Community Foundation.
Appalachian
Community Foundation. Mm-hmm. They're one of our grantees on our website.
Okay.
And they're great.
We actually have that link on a slide, Brittany, if you could move it to the second to last slide.
Gotcha. Apparently there's like some drawing going on here. Don't really know how to...
Oh, there it is right there.
Nice.
Take that off of there. Sorry, I don't know how to do this.
You're doing great, Brittany.
Oh, goodness. Okay.
So it was there. That was it right there. There you go. Appalachian Community Fund. And they work in Appalachia with sort of states in that area and some parts of states in West Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, and they're great. So
Awesome. Thank you so much. Okay. Looks like Ada is sending some messages in. Chloe, do you have any other questions that are coming up on your end?
No.
Okay. Panelists, do y'all have anything y'all want to ask or contribute before we go into the wrap up? Alrighty. Well, thank y'all so much. I know as being like a grassroots organizer myself before coming into this work, being able to locate funding was definitely difficult. So I really appreciate y'all sharing everything, sharing your expertise, and being so willing to have all of our participants be able to contact you all. So thank you all. And thank you for the participants that joined us on the call. I think at one point in time, I saw that we had up to 51 participants. So that's really awesome. Just a few closing reminders. We do have a survey about tonight's webinar. Chloe will be posting the link to the survey in the chat box, and we also have it up here on the slide as well. If you could please give us your feedback, let us know how we did, give us any suggestions for future ideas for a webinar that you all might be interested in. We greatly appreciate it. And as I said before, we will follow up with all the links that were in the chat box, all the links to the various funders' websites, and plenty more resources for of other organizations who are doing grassroots funding. And other than that, I think I am done.
Thank you so much for the campaign for Southern Equality, for running the LGBTQ in the South listserv and having us all on this webinar.
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you,
y'all.
Chloe and Brittany, for your work. And thank you to everyone who attended. Feel free to reach out to us if you all have questions or want to know more information.
Absolutely.
I just wanted to get it out there.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you all so very much. And y'all have a good evening.
Okay, we've done it. Oops.